put together just a little short video of doing a pre-flight, startup, and taxi in the Cessna 172 G1000. This is the default aircraft within Flight Simulator. I haven't really made a bunch of changes to it. And the purpose of me doing this video is that personally I haven't been in the real, flying the real G1000 172 that I do fly out of Deer Valley Airport in a couple of months now. And so I'm actually also due for a biannual flight review. Every other year we have to go out and prove to the FAA stewards, instructors, that we can still safely pilot an aircraft and keep ourselves safe in the operation. So I'm due for one of those, and thought I'd do some just walkthrough practice. You know, one of the benefits and the beauty of having Flight Simulator is that you've got this tool that's in front of you, even if you're not a current pilot, that just gets your head in the right place. And you can take it as serious as you want or be as casual as you want, obviously. But if you really are trying to earn your private pilot's certificate or you're practicing up for some maneuvers or some currency flights, it's a really great tool to get your head in the game. Whether or not it simulates the flight perfectly is a debate that everyone has ad nauseum on other channels, and I won't get into that. But it does absolutely help you get your head in the game and think through the procedures if you want to do so. So that's what I'm doing today. And one of the things I always like to say, even as I'm sitting here standing on the ramp, is that pre-flight process really starts for me. It could start up to 24 to 48 hours before my flight, depending on the mission. For me, my mission is going to be basically, as I mentioned, a BFR flight review. If it's a cross-country trip or I'm planning to take a bit more time in the aircraft, I might take a little bit more time on the front end. But the point is that doesn't start at the airport, doesn't start on the ramp, that starts at home. And it can be 24 to 48 hours, as I mentioned, where you're taking a look at the big picture, the trends, the weather trends, what's coming up, what's affecting the area right now might not be affecting the area tomorrow. So it's really about what's coming forward in the next, again, 24 to 48 hours, the next 12 hours. What are the big weather trends? Are there fronts moving in? What's the temperature change going to be? What are the winds looking like? What's the cloud cover? What are the conditions at the airport and around the surrounding area where you're going to be flying your route of flight? So it's all the time for you to sit down with whatever your favorite flight planning tool is. And if it's for a real flight, obviously an official FAA or a tool that you can use with official data. For me, I happen to use the FAA sources. I use DUATs. I also use 4Flight, which has vast majority of the information that I need on my iPad. Right at my fingertips is a 4Flight app. I recommend it even for those that do not have a certificate that are flying in the simulator, because you can fly along, as you may know, with 4Flight in your flight simulator, simulated flights, and it's as if you were in the real airplane. The 4Flight functions exactly the same. So it's a great tool to just start learning about the environment of flight planning and using it as a companion tool on your flight. So great thing to take a look at. But I go through all of those things before I even get to the airport. Once I have that knowledge in hand and I know what I'm about to deal with, and I get to the airport, next thing I'm going to do is check out the aircraft itself. And you'll normally get the maintenance logs or maintenance books for the aircraft. For me, as I mentioned, I'm a rental pilot. I don't own my own airplane. I'd love to. I just don't fly enough to really justify the cost of doing so. I'm not quite at 50 hours a year, so if I were, yeah, I'd be all over that. But for me right now, rental is the best way for me to go, and I've got some fantastic equipment to rent. So it really does make it more cost effective for me. But I'll get the maintenance logs. I'll take a look at any squawks that were written up by previous pilots. Take a look and make sure that they were satisfied to my liking. Take a look at last 50 hour, time to 50 hour, time to 100 hour, VOR checks, any of those types of things. Just taking a look at the logbooks to make sure that the aircraft is airworthy and there's no issues that I might come into. It's not uncommon. I've had it happen so many times in the past, especially with rental aircraft, where you'll go through the squawks and you'll see small things might be up and they might not be critical items. They'll probably be placarded in the aircraft, so you'll know. Things like the autopilot, for instance. Again, for me locally, VFR, I never use the autopilot. Longer cross country, sure, but never local, so that's never really an issue for me if that's the case. One of the more common things I see are things like nose wheel shimmies, particularly on student aircraft, when you're training sort of non-commercial seeking student pilots. That's an issue. It used to be an issue for me during my primary in Maryland. Here, not so much, because most of the pilots that are training here are going after commercial and ATP type ratings, so they're they're a little bit more gentle with the equipment. But that's the type of thing you want to be looking for. Once you've got those books in hand, I take a walk out, start looking around. Everything about flying is getting yourself immersed in what it is you're doing, putting your head in the game. And you'll probably notice that you may even take on sort of a different mind space or persona when you're at the airport, because you're just taking in and processing so much information as you're about to fly. Walking out to the aircraft is another opportunity to take in some of that information. Look at what the winds are doing. You heard what the ATIS was, probably because you did it in your pre-flight. Take a look at the runway environment. Which way are the planes taking off and landing? How much traffic is out there? What's going on the ramp? Just all those things give you cues about what you can expect. As you're walking out to the airplane, that's another opportunity to just take in what is going on. Look at the airplane as she sits. Is it a flat tire? Is it leaning to one side? Are there puddles underneath of it? Anything leaking? What's the tie downs? Are the tie downs on? Is there anything obstructing your path? I don't know, those types of things you just want to visually check out as you're walking up to your aircraft, and then make sure that everything is good. Typically once I get into the airplane and I get myself set up, I'll use my checklists. And you guys all have checklists. I'm sure you've used them. Many of you are using them to simulate your flight with In-Flight Simulator. So, that's one of the first things I do, and I've got a set of them that the flight school provides that I get, and I have my own that I use, that I've used over time, and I will check that. Now, the aircraft acceptance process is basically me getting into the airplane itself and going through a couple of different checks once I'm inside the airplane, and ensuring that the airplane is ready to go. There's usually a control wheel lock that's in here. We'll take that out and get that out of the way. Make sure I've got the starting key available. Make sure that the mags are turned off. Basically, you want a cold and dark aircraft. So everything's off, lights are off, avionics switch is off. You don't have the ability to move the yoke when you're in the airplane, but you can move around it a lot easier than you can in the sim. So we're just checking everything's off, checking the fuse panel, everything is clear, all switches and everything's off. We'll note the tachometer. Now that's when you get the battery switch on, and we do that because we want to check and make sure that the numbers in the book when you receive the aircraft, if it flew before you, it's going to have hobs in, hobs out, and tack times. And you just want to make sure that those are consistent, that someone else didn't take the airplane before you and not write something down. Because the truth, so basically, I like to use the term I heard from something I watched a while ago, rumors and facts. The logbook is a rumor. The hobs meter and the tack on the airplane is a fact. So you always back it up with your facts. So once we have everything set, all switches are off, we're going to get the battery on, just the right side of the master, which is linked to my TOS system test. And one of the things in the airplane, again, you can ignore some of this stuff here, right? Because, for instance, when you flip on the battery, the standby battery does not turn on by itself. That's something that you would normally check as part of your pre-flight. But they've tried to make things obviously simple for all pilots and not overcomplicate things, and I can appreciate that. But just know that these two are not tied together. When you turn on the battery, obviously this does not turn on. It is a separate switch. So the battery comes on, and again, you would check your tack time, which in this particular simulation of the aircraft, it does not show that. But there would be a tack time in here that would show. We would confirm that with the logbook, and we'd also confirm over here the Hobbs meter time. And you can see it's about 17 hours on this particular version since the last time I've installed this. Fuel quantity indicators we would check, and you can see we're about half full, and that's fine for pattern work. That's all we need. This aircraft may have been out flying before we came back in, and I plan on just doing a little short flight. So make sure your fuel is where it needs to be. If not, obviously add more. You're going to look for your low fuel annunciator. Lights should be off, which they are. The oil pressure annunciator light should be on, which it is. You should have a low volt annunciator on, which it is. And the low vac should also be on, and amber, which it is. Interior lights, we don't need to worry about that at the moment. Pitot heat and exterior lights. We don't need to turn the pitot heat on. We're not instrument, but one of the things I also like to do is, depending on the flight, just making sure that your lights all work. And I don't spend a whole lot of time doing this because naturally you don't want to burn up the battery, but you go out and flip on the nav lights, flip on the strobe lights. Particularly the one to really be most concerned about during the daytime is your landing lights and your strobe lights and your beacon light. Those are the three critical ones that you want to make sure are functioning properly, especially in the pattern where you might spend a whole lot of time with your landing lights on just to be more visible to other aircraft. And of course your strobe light and your beacon are critical as well to let other aircraft know you are nearby and your engine is running. We'll then go ahead and take a look at the avionics, basically the avionics switches, and listen for the fan. Now this is going to be another thing that in the simulator you won't hear, but when you flip on the avionics bus 1, it typically powers certain things in the aircraft, and you would hear a fan whirring behind this the dash here, the cockpit instrument panel. You'd hear a fan going. So we're going to listen for that, and then we turn off bus 1, we turn on bus 2, which will then power on the second G1000, and then there's a fan in the back, which you would hear that as well. So you're basically just making sure that the avionics fans are running so that you don't have to worry about any overheating electrical components. Turn everything off. And the reason why this display is on again is because it automatically switched on this standby battery. Now this is something that we would actually test. We'll get to that. But basically right now, if I didn't have that on, this display wouldn't work. So that's the reason why I think they defaulted to have it on. So it's breaking the realism a little bit, but it gives you an idea of what's going on. The next thing we're going to do is get our flaps fully down. And as that's moving, I'm going to check, the left and the right, just make sure that the tracks are clear and there's nothing obstructing anything in the way. Once we have our flaps down, we can go ahead and get a battery switch turned back off. And then we're going to head outside and do our external pre-flight. Now, the external pre-flight starts right at the cockpit door and into the front cabin, and we're going to duck underneath this flap here. And we're going to just start working our way down the aircraft. First thing we're going to take a look is the baggage door and just make sure that baggage door is secure, and there's nothing, there's basically nothing open. It's unlocked. It's not hanging out in the breeze or anything like that. So that's one of the first things we're going to take a look at. We'll look at the autopilot static port, which is just behind that, just behind where the baggage door would be. Now some of these things visually on the model you won't see, but there is a static port there that's for the actual autopilot. We're going to come on back to the elevator area, and as we make our way around here, we're going to check the backside and just take a look visually again, looking at over everything. We'll take a look back here at the elevator and the elevator trim. There is actually a trim knob or trim, which we'll see here in just a moment. But one of the things I'll do once we get back here is just basically move the controls and make sure everything is smooth. Also, a thing to note is underneath of the there's obviously the flight controls, and the flight controls are connected to cables, and those cables are then connected to the actual flight control surface that we're actually manipulating. So there are these little cables that are here, and as you can see, as you move the rudder in this case, you'll see that these cables are attached. Now it's an oversimplified drawing. They're actually little cotter pins that are in here that hold the connecting components together, and we like to visually inspect to make sure that those cotter pins are there. And that they're functioning the way that we expect them to. So that's just one thing visually that we'll look for. We'll do the same thing on the vertical stabilizer. We'll take a look at that and just, again, take a look at the VOR antennas. We'll move that in around, just move the rudder around a little bit to make sure we're good. We come over to this right side elevator, and this is where you'll see, now there's a little tab on the back here. It's another thing to take a look at on the back of the rudder in the 172 is that little tab. It is adjustable, it's bendable. And sometimes you'll get, that's kind of like a rudder trim for you. So it's always good to just make sure that that's not, damaged or out of whack, just to make sure that that's set properly. The trim tab is here, and you can see it almost looks like a little flap in the elevator. And when you roll your trim wheel or use your electronic trim within the 172, it will control this little trim tab here. And as such, it also has a little connector back there. And as we zoom into it, I love how they have the detail of the aluminum fin. It's exactly what it looks like. But as you zoom into it, there'd be the same thing. There'd be a little cotter pin that's in here. Just want to make sure that these things are connected and there's no damage. It's not bent. There's nothing, in the way, if you will. So just a couple things to note. And again, on this side, we'll do the exact same procedure that we did before, which is to move the elevator up and down and just make sure from a movement perspective, everything looks good. Great. Satisfied with that. We kind of move around to the front side. We're going to visually inspect the front side, just make sure everything's good here. We'll continue along the right side fuselage, just checking along our antennas, making sure that all of our comm radio antennas are good. I also like to, get down and look underneath There's some antennas under here. We just want to make sure nothing's damaged or broken. And depending on how well the school keeps the airplane, this could be a dirty bit down here. But at the end of the day, the aerials and antennas are all covered, so nothing to really worry about here. We'll come around to the back side, check the rear windshield. We'll check the back side of the flaps. And usually when I do that, I just kind of physically go out and give them just a little shake up and down just to make sure they're good. We'll come around to the right side, and while I'm on the back side of the airplane, we'll go ahead and move the ailerons. And as we're doing that, we'll check that the left side, when we move one side, the other side moves in the opposite direction is what we'd expect to see, right? So when the right side is up, the left side is down and vice versa. Check those static discharge wicks, those little plastic things that are hanging off there. They tend to get broken off over time. They help discharge and shed the static load in the airplane, which is, can be important to keep electrical noise down in the system. We would check our lights just to make sure that everything looks good with the lights. We'll come underneath the wing, and then once we're under the wing, we're going to end up doing the same thing as we did over here. Only this time, when we get under the wing and we move our ailerons, we're going to be checking to make sure that the hinges and mechanisms are all good underneath there. There's little hinges in there that we want to just make sure are clear, and that the track is functioning properly. And we'll continue on down to the front, and again, visually, the aircraft here in the simulator is not fully modeled. That's actually a little light, that little black spot that's there. It's kind of interesting on the show. But there are actually drains in here too, so which I'm going to get to in just a second. So we're going to continue on down, and we're going to get down to the flaps. And when we get down to the flaps, there are, again, same thing. There's a light actually right here where that was. I think what they've done is actually put these marks in here for the drains, but they're still not there. There's a light here, but basically, again, underneath this side of the flap, you'll get under there, just kind of give the flaps a little shake up and down just to make sure they're attached, nothing's in the way. And then critically check these rollers to make sure that they're clear and free of travel. We're going to come down and we're going to check this connection right here, make sure that it is connected to the flap properly, because that's your actuator. So that can create a problem. If it breaks, you'll get an asymmetric flap movement or something of that nature. And we just come all the way down to the end. I'll check the landing gear at this point and just take a look down. Now, this one has the fairings or the speed fairings, whatever you want to call them, attached to them. But there's a little door down here, and that's how you can get to your valve stem if it's positioned properly. So I can check for air. I use that just to visually peek and see whatever I can. The disadvantage to these, which is why in many flight schools you will not see them attached, is it just creates additional work for the A&P mechanics to service the brakes and the tires, which get done quite often in a flight school. So that's why you see a lot of flight schools do not have these attached. They look pretty, and they do maybe add a little bit of aerodynamic ism to you, I guess, or speed or whatever. But the point is you can't really check the brakes and a lot of things as well as you could if they were not there. So with them not being there, you can get a better view. Then we'd come up here, basically check the fuel drains, and there are 5 of them in the airplane, and they're each wing, 5 of them on each wing rather. There's 5 on this side, 5 on the left, and 3 underneath. So there's 13 total drains and sumps, and you're checking those for, as you may have already known, you're checking them for water and contaminants in the fuel. The tanks in the airplane are as bladder tanks in the wing, and they're obviously gravity fed to the engine, so they're kind of cantilevered forward towards the fuselage, since the wing has dihedral, so the outer tips of the wing are higher than the lower. That aids in the gravity feeding, and because water is heavier than the fuel, it will sink down into these little sumps, which are strategically placed along the wing. 2 of them in the front side here. There's a couple on the front of the wing here, and so you'll drain those out just to make sure that there's no water in the fuel or any other contaminants that could become a problem in the airplane. So you want to drain those until those are running clear, and usually they always are. And you have a little fuel strainer to do that job, so it's not a big deal. Okay, we'll come back out. What I like to do then is come back out underneath the wing and get myself out from underneath the wing. And at this point, I'm going to check visually the front area of the wing, just looking at the surface, making sure that there's no damage to the front spar, making sure that the strut is good. And this is a good opportunity where you see this little eyelet that's here, right here, this little ring. That's where the wing tie downs go. So when you put your chains in there, or ropes or whatever it is that you're using at your airport, that's where you tie that through. So good opportunity now to untie that. I didn't mention that in the tail, and that's one that sometimes pilots hint can overlook. I did it in my early years, and I remember getting in the plane and firing up and pushing the throttle forward, and we didn't go anywhere. And it was like, oh crap, the tail tie down is still here on this little eyelet connected. So When you're doing the inspections, great time to unhook those chains. We're checking the front spar. We have openings here for the vent into the cabin and for the wing itself. And then we have a little step here, because what we're going to do after we've checked the front and this front windshield is we're going to get up on top and we're going to visually verify the fuel. And a beautiful thing about the Cessna, again, rumors and facts, the fuel gauge is a rumor to some degree because it's accurate, right? But the fact is going into the tank and checking it. So here we have a step and a step. So it's, for me, it's like a right hand here, right foot here, left foot here, climb up and check it out. This little door here is actually super critical for me here in Arizona, and for others, I'm sure. It's a vent, and that usually pops open and allows air to be drawn into the cabin, in addition to these cabin vents, which are fed from these holes here. So we would do our little pop-up on top of the wing, take a look up here, and fuel caps. Now, the fuel will have its markings on there about 100 low lead only and avgas and all that good stuff, and amount of usable fuel, etc. 53 gallons of fuel usable in the 172. When you take off these caps, there are actually, it's really hard to describe here visually, but they're called, you'll hear someone say the tanks are full to the tabs. Now you can fill the tank completely, which adds a little bit extra weight, a couple extra gallons, different extra gallons of pounds of fuel that goes in there. So it does add a little weight. Common practice in this environment here that I fly in is the tanks are full up to the tabs. And when you open that up, you'll see there's literally a tab that dips down into the tank. It's curved like this, and it's a little tab that goes down into the tank, and you'll see the fuel hitting that tab. So that kind of gives you the fact of how much fuel that you have in the tank, because you know what that tank tab is. I then visually check the top of the wing just to make sure everything's good here. Looks great. And then I come my touch to the engine. So in the engine compartment, again, be great. These things, future models, if they simulate, there's a fantastic 172 for X-Plane from a company called Airfoil Labs, and they simulate the entire pre-flight process down to the sound of what the flaps sound like when you give them a shake. It's quite amazing that they capture that much fidelity. But we're going to check oil. Click the button here. This makes it look like it's a screw. It's not. You have to get in here because this is the only way you check your oil. There's no oil level instrument in the airplane. Just like in your car, typically it's not a level, right? It tells you pressure, but you don't get a level. So you got to click this open, and right below there is a yellow capped dipstick that you pull out on a nice long metal rod, and it'll show you, that's a circular rod, and it'll show you exactly what your oil level reading is. You want in the 172 at least a minimum of 6 quarts in the 172, so you'll check that. And then while you're in there, you can see a little bit around the engine compartment. You'll check in the firewall area just to make sure there's no damage or nothing looks burnt or no birds or hornet's nest thing in it. So you just want to check things out while you're in there. We're going to come down and we're going to check all of our screws around the cowling just to make sure things are fastened up. Especially if your plane came out of a 100-hour inspection. These guys want to get it back on the line. Just make sure you're not missing anything here that might cause some vibration or some issues on the cowling. So we're going to check that cowling, come around to the front side of the nose, and we're going to check the prop and the spinner. Basic things here, same thing. Check the screws. You're going to run your fingers along the edge of the props and just check for any chips, abrasions, any cracks or deformities in the prop itself. You really just want to check those things out and make sure that everything looks good and your spinner is intact and not loose. Poke your head around in here, and actually they've done a somewhat decent job. There's your little alternator that's right here in the front of the engine. And I always stick my head in here and make sure that there's no bird nests or anything else that's in here. Your plane sits outside, it's a possibility. You checking and pulling on the belt for the alternator, that you can check that. Check the other side as well, and just make sure the area is clear. I pop down here and look at the air filter. This is the inlet into the engine, just like in your car. Make sure that is clear. Check the exhaust pipe and make sure there's no cracking or anything on there. And then you come down and you check your strut. When I talked about that nose wheel shimmy, this is what causes that problem. You put your nose wheel down and all of a sudden this thing starts flapping around and you're like, oh my God, what the hell's going on? It's because these rods that connect to the pedals, which then turn the nose wheel to the left or to the right a certain amount of degrees, they can get a little slack, and this dampener right here is what creates some of the issue. When this is going bad, you have issues. And you can also take a look at your strut. One of my instructors told me 4-finger widths. So you hold your hand open flat. 4-finger widths is about the maximum amount of bare metal you want to see here. That's the compression on that strut that you want to see during your pre-flight. So you'll check that out. Come around to the right side cowling, make sure that the right side cowling looks good. And then you're going to check this here is a door for 12 volt. So if you are 24 volt rather, for the external battery, if you had an external battery option in the airplane, that would be here. Your static port, your alternate static port, your static port here, that you would your static port here. That's a critical one. You want to make sure that that's clear and there's a little pinhole in there, that it's good. Again, same thing here. Left hand, left foot, right foot goes up here and up you go. Check your vents, clear. Do your tank, open up the cap, check to make sure you're to the tabs or whatever you're expecting to see in there. You're going to just visually check that. You're going to come down the front side of the wing, check your strut, check your pitot tube. Again, if you are IFR or flying in the conditions, you'd want to make sure that this pitot tube was working properly. You turn it on the pitot heater and make sure that the heat works. Do it quickly because it does get hot. But for any pilot flying in any condition, you want to make sure that the tube entry is not blocked. There's a drain in the back for things like water so that it can drain out. But if you get bugs or any kind of thing stuffed up in there, this feeds your static instruments. So if that's blocked, you're going to have a problem with a lot of instruments reading your airspeed. There's going to be issues with instrumentation. Just make sure that that is not blocked. Continue on the front. The one thing that's missing in the visual representation is the fuel vent. There's a little metal shaped almost like this. It comes down like a little J, and it's a vent tube. And if you get expansion in the tanks, this is when you have heating. You get expansion. Fuel has to have somewhere to go. If your tanks are super full, you can get some weeping out of that tube. A little bit of fuel might weep out of there, and that's by design, but that's not modeled here, so you don't see that. This little thing that looks curiously covered typically would not be. That's your stall warning horn. So you can test that if you really want to be adventurous and wipe away some of the bugs that are here. You can put your mouth on there or just take a tissue and cover the hole and then make a vacuum suction. Because that's what happens when the wing stalls, is it creates a vacuum over the front part of the wing, and that vacuum then operates that little reed valve that's in there that creates that famous stall warning horn that you hear in the airplane. That's where it comes from. Check your landing lights. Again, you've turned them on earlier, so you know that they're good, but you just make sure the glass is not cracked. Again, leading edge, continue to check. Come around the other side, check your the other side of your lights, make sure everything looks good and is connected well. Same thing on the underside here. We're going to do the exact same thing we did on the right side. Check the ailerons, just move those kind of up and around. Check the piano hinges that are in there, make sure that they're good. We're going to come down the other side of the wing, check the flaps. Do the same thing on the flaps. Give them a little jiggle up and down, make sure they're good. Come around the front, check the door. I will then drain the fuel. Again, sumps, get the fuel sumps drained out. Again, there's 5 of them on this side as well. So you want to get those all drained out. Take a walk back, and so when you get done that 5th one, you're going to be about here, so then you can come down and get your tie down off your chain, off your strut, and come back towards the front of the aircraft. And again, same thing here. We're going to check our landing gear and make sure that we take a peek at what we ever can see on the wheels and just make sure everything looks good there. The other thing I forgot to mention, guys, I missed it, and you probably caught it and you've been screaming at me this whole time, is when you are over here, when we check that exhaust, there are 3 drains under here, sumps for the fuel that you need to check. There's 2 up here by the front, under the front of the engine, and there's 1 back here. And you want to check all 3 of those and make sure that those are, again, free of debris and free of any liquid. And if it is, you just want to drain it, and that may be a flight scrapping event if it's really contaminated, because there might be something going on. Back over here, we were finishing up with the wheels. We'll finish up with the doors, make sure that that's unlocked. And then basically then what I like to do is just take just a little pop out. A lot of people don't do this. Maybe it's a little old school. I don't know. I just I always like to, again, pivot back and take a quick spin around the airplane just to make sure that that there's no something I missed, right? Like that chain on the tail. I would have caught that had I done that walk around. If you missed it when you did your first walkthrough, that's why it's good to do that walk around, because something as simple as a chain connected can make the start of your flight, kind of could be a start of a bad day. When those types of things happen, as most incidents that take place in aviation are a chain of events. And literally something as small as you forgetting the chain could be an indicator to you that, hey man, you might not be 100% there today. So pay attention, slow down, take it easy, and break the chain, so to speak. So don't start letting one thing snowball into the next thing, I've been on flights personally with an instructor when I was doing like a BFR flight training, and you just felt that one thing led to another. And I literally had to say, you know what, I need to level the plane out. I'm just going to fly, and I'm just going to chill for a little bit, because I'm getting in my head and I'm getting too worked up over this BFR, and I need to slow things down. Don't ever be afraid to slow things down. That keeps pilots safe. Don't rush through. Don't let an instructor ever rush you through. A lot of times these instructors, they get in their plane and they're trying to go. I don't care. If you get paid by the hour, I'm paying for you by the hour. You're going to take my time to go through this, and I'm going to make sure I do it right so that we both come home safe. So that's an important thing, just kind of imparting a little bit of my own personal lessons there with you there. So the exterior pre-flight has been completed. I know it takes a little bit of time, but that's about the time it would take. Maybe a little faster, if I wasn't yammering through it the whole time. But I wanted to just give you guys visually a look at how that's done, so that you have an understanding of the things you go through to do a full and proper pre-check. Now, we're inside the airplane now. We've got our headsets all hooked up. Typically I like to keep my headset. I open the window because it's hot here all the time, and I kind of drape my headset over the thing here, the window frame, while I'm getting the rest of the airplane set up. I adjust my seat. Underneath here, there's a little crank that you can adjust your seat. I usually do that. Best thing to do is outside the airplane. Once you put your butt in the seat, it's a little bit harder to move that, but you can. And then there's a lever next to it that you can pull up, like in your car, and scoot yourself forward or backward to adjust. I like to sit close enough, but then also once I get seated, I make sure that when I pull my control all the way out, this tends to hit my knee. I'm tall, I'm 6'1", so for me, I like to be close to feeling in control. I don't like feeling floaty and far away, so I don't sit far back. I sit pretty close up, but then I also have to make sure that the controls are not going to get, bunch up on my knee or hit me in the leg while I'm doing it, especially when I have my knee pad down here too. So just one thing to check. So now that we're inside the aircraft, we would check a couple things. That we have the G1000 Cockpit Reference Guide. That's usually behind the seat. I check that. We've got the aircraft manuals in here as well. I put my my checklist in this little pocket here. That's where I store any small little items that I need here as well. We also then checked that the fuel selector valve is on both tanks. I've flown this 172, 152 for so many years, and that's one thing you always just want to check. The fuel shutoff valve is in. The flight controls are free and correct, which we just basically checked by just making sure that nothing's bound up. That's another indication to make sure there's no locks or anything on any of the controls. The brakes tested and applied. I know we have a parking brake in this aircraft, but the reality of it is, because of when these things are tied in, I've never ever have gotten into one of these rental aircraft and had the parking brake on. It just never happens. So just, know that we have it, but in many cases, because the airplane's either tied up or chalked down, this parking brake is never applied. At least it hasn't been in the ones that I typically fly. So we're going to get to starting the engine now. Again, just taking a general look around, make sure everything is good. Battery switches are off. Avionics bus 1 and 2 is off. The standby battery switch. Now this is where we test the standby battery. Now because everything's off, it'll work the way it's supposed to. So we go into the test and we hold this here for about 20 seconds. You see the test light comes on. Now what would also happen here, which doesn't happen in the sim, is that the left PFD would actually fire up. So you hold this down and you're basically using this to make sure the standby battery in the aircraft works properly. If you lose all electric power, you can switch this on. It actually will come on automatically because it'll be armed, and you want to make sure that your battery holds this. If you push this down and you don't get this green light, there's an issue with your backup, and that could be a concern. In an all-glass airplane, I probably wouldn't be flying that day. No, not probably. Definitely would not be flying in the aircraft that day, because in the unlikely event of a complete electrical failure, alternator failure, you have nothing to reference. Certainly could be done, but that's something you want to be aware of. As I mentioned, it's going to fire up the PFD, in which case it doesn't in this aircraft, and you would be then checking for the minimum bus volts. You want at least 24 volts minimum. You'd be also checking for your M bus or master bus volts, or 1.5 or less. check your standby amp. So all these things would be done with this in the test position. Now we go to the battery switch on. And in this case, again, I got to use my honeycomb. In this case, you would check that out here. For me, the aircraft that we fly has TIS, our traffic information system. So it's part of the self-test. I'll get an audible TIS not available message that'll come over the air. That's, it's a self-test of the system itself. Lights as required. We're going to go ahead and get the nav light on, and we'll get the beacon light on as well. Engine priming as required. Now for this one, with the 172, obviously fuel injected.
System test. Okay.
And there's my TAWS system test, which I also have in the aircraft as well. So that would, you'd hear that also. Engine priming as required. So for this, we're going to go mixture full rich, throttle full forward. Okay, so full mixture, full throttle. And the fuel pump would then come on and off. Now, really quickly, I'll explain. In this aircraft, when you clip on the fuel pump in the simulator, you're going to be looking for your fuel flow in gallons per hour. When you turn it on here, it just spikes. It just goes up and just sits where it was. In the real airplane, it's gradual. You turn the pump, you hear that, and then it will slowly get up, and it'll stabilize. Once it stabilizes, you can shut the pump off. Now the engine's primed. You do it too long, you put too much fuel in, you flood the engine, it'll be a little hard to start. You don't do it long enough, you don't put enough fuel in, it'll be hard to start. So these engines are pretty straightforward. I know some that could be a bit crankier, but this one here, fuel flow on, it's usually about 3 seconds. It's good enough. Then the pump goes back off. The throttle, we come back and we open it 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch, just crack it. The mixture comes completely off. The mixture's lean. Okay, we check our propeller area. Brakes are set, or we hold the brakes like I have mine here. We check out the window, left and right, clear prop. Hand on the throttle, I'm sorry, hand on the mixture. Oh, wait a minute. Let me see if I can get my thing going here. Where are we at? Yeah, so we want to get the throttle set, because for the mixture, once the engine fires up, you need to enrichen the mixture, because if you don't, it's going to shut off, because again, this is cut off, so there's no fuel entering the engine at this point from the mixture standpoint. So what we're going to do with the throttle set, we're going to fire up the engine. It's going to turn on, and it could be around 1,000 RPM, close to it, with that 1/4 to 1/8 inch crack at the throttle. That's why you have that crack too. But the mixture is the one we have to get to straight away. So we're going to go ahead and get a start. Slowly advance that mixture to full, and you can see with that crack of the throttle, we're sitting right at about 830 RPM. We want to immediately check to make sure that our oil pressure comes up. That's the first thing you want to look for as a good start. If you have no pressure, you need to abort that start and shut that engine off quickly. We're going to get up to about 1,000 RPM. And then just check that everything is looking good there. So mixture is 1,000, oil pressure, as I said, the first thing we check. Mixture, now we lean out. So on the ground, for taxi purposes, we would lean out. Now for this one, we go up to about 1,200 RPM. And then we basically take our mixture, and then we'll lean it back until we get a little bit of a drop. And this will get a nice lean condition to keep the plugs clean. There we go. Now, yeah, typically once you lean that back, you'll see the engine will run rough a little bit. If you go too far, it'll start running rough. Just advance it a little bit in front of that. Enriching the mixture just a little bit from the rough setting, and you'll have a nice lean mixture setting for idle on the ground. We do that to keep the spark plugs in the airplane clean. We don't want to have any issue with fouling of plugs. So that's what we do to lean. Alternator comes on next, so we can get a charge going, and that completes the starting engine checklist. The next thing we're going to do is the after start checks, and that started off with an avionics bus, so turning the bus 1 and bus 2 on and let those systems initialize. It's so great here because of the GPS is in here. You know, it's not like in the airliners where you have an INS system that takes, you know, super accurate, but to get those ring lasers going and spun up the way they need to be and figuring out where they are, as you know, it could take 5, 6, 7 minutes pretty quick in the G1000, obviously for obvious reasons with the GPS. So it works really well. Avionics bus 1 and 2 is on. You're just basically checking your MFD and make sure that it is set how you want it. maps, anything else that you need to get set up here, you would go ahead and pre-flight that and get that going, get your radio set. You know, the first thing I do, we're going to actually bring the idle back down to 1,000. You know, always just be aware you've got a running engine now in this at a busy airport, and like that, you know, I have people behind you and things like that. So you want to check that that's all good. Radios and nav set. So basically, we would go ahead and for me, what I'm going to do is go ahead and check the ATIS. So we're going to tune in the ATIS, ATIS for Deer Valley Airport. 26.5. And, you know, this obviously gives you all the information you need to know about where, what runways are in use, the weather condition, most importantly, your altimeter setting.
Deer Valley Airport information, Quebec 1700
Quebec.
Zulu.
I would write this down.
209er at 8. Visibility 10. Sky condition, few clouds at 1,000 feet, few clouds at 4,100 feet, few clouds at 12,100 feet.
Love this ATIS here. It's crazy.
Temperature 25.
2.5.
2.10. Altimeter 29er decimal 88. Visual runway 25 left and visual runway 25 right in use. Landing and departing runway 25
This
left and
annoys me
runway
too.
25 right. VFR aircraft say direction of flight. All aircraft read back hold short instructions. Advise controller on initial contact you have Quebec.
Okay, so Quebec is current, and we're going to be
Romeo 1700
really.
Zulu. Wind 209er at 8. Visibility 10. Sky condition, few cloud. Deer Valley Airport information.
You saw that, right? I put the ground frequency and switched it, but it stayed on ATIS. Maybe that was just me, but okay, so now we've got ground. So I like to set my frequencies up as well on the way. So we've already got ATIS. We have ground as the active frequency. And then the next thing we'd want to do is put the tower in on standby. So we would kind of get that set ahead of time so that we have all the frequencies we need ready to go. If there was a departure frequency we needed, like for Phoenix here, that's 120.7. I would set that up here while I'm on the ground if need be, so that I can contact Phoenix. If I was going out to the east, I would put Scottsdale Tower in here. Just, you know, keep ahead of the airplane, put the frequencies in if you know them ahead of time, so that you're ready. It's one less thing that you've got to worry about while you're here in the airplane. So the radios and navs have been set. We've got our standby altimeters, everything set. The G1000 altimeter bug, altitude bug. You could set that if you wanted, if you're doing local flight. You know, for me, I usually get up to about 3,000 locally before I figure out higher altitudes going down the road. The heading bug, we can set that. I usually will, in some cases, I'll set that for the wind. You saw me kind of rotating around when I heard the ATIS, but I stopped. But normally I'll just wait until I get lined up on the runway, or I can set it, you know, now and just set it roughly to the runway heading in case I forget. And again, this is a good practice to get into because, you know, if you have this as a reference, right, it gives you a good reference of the direction you need to be flying in. So we know we're taking off on 25, so that's another little reminder of what runway to use. The barometer's been set to 9.88. We've got transponders should be set and on, so it's 1200. It's on standby. So what I'm going to do is get that turned on to on. And that'll make sure, because of the environment that we're in the ground, we want to make sure that the transponder's working. Flaps, next thing to do is flaps are going to come up, and for the flaps we just bring them up and, you know, visually inspect. Needles moving down here, we check outside, make sure the flaps are coming up outside, nothing's being pinched or bound or not working. So we just check all that, make sure that that's all good. All right, so now that we've got that done, we're just about the end of the after start checklist. We would then brief our departure route. Now for us, we are going to be departing off the 25. So 25 right is going to be 25 left rather is going to be our departing runway, and that'll take us right out here to where this fuel truck is. Incidentally, it's kind of interesting. I think the fuel carrier now is Atlantic over there. It may be different. It changes, you know, maybe a couple times a year, but depending on who the carrier is, there's a little fuel sign that's here because the fueling station's here. And that's where we stop. That kind of is the end of the non-movement area. So everything in here, ATC doesn't care about. You can move your planes around. You don't have to talk to anyone. Once you get right about to this part of this airport, and every airport has its movement and non-movement areas, you've kind of got to know that, right? When do I need to contact ground to get instructions to taxi and move on the surface? For here at Deer Valley, it's pretty much where that fuel truck is. So we'll taxi out, anticipating that the tower is going to give us taxi instructions down taxiway Charlie to the end of 25, to 25 left, and we're going to be departing the area to the north. So those are the things you want to let your controller know on the way out. So at this point in time, that's been cleared, so we're going to go ahead and get our taxi light on. I'm going to release the parking brake. I still have my brakes set. We're going to check left and right, and we only apply as much power as we need to get out of the parking spot. In some cases, there's a little divot where the tires are, and it may require a little bit more to get you moving. But you don't need to, fire the thing up 2,000 RPM or whatever to get yourself moving. It's just enough to get the aircraft turned, rolling. Again, you want to be careful about FOD. You want to be careful that there's probably people behind you. Just be aware of your prop blast. We'll do a quick brake check once we're getting straight. Engines to idle. Check my brakes. If I had my instructor or someone else, I might have them check their brakes. But basically, I'm the PIC, so I only need to really worry about mine. We're going to check the area as we taxi left and right. Check that that's clear. Maintain turn here. Maintain the center line of the taxiway. Again, you can keep your RPMs fairly low, right? The one thing you also want to note with the ATIS, as we stop here, let's pull that back up again for a second, right? So I want to talk about one other little thing. I think I missed that. So I think the ones were about 220. I can't remember exactly what they were, but again, you would have written this down, right? So that's one thing. Carry an E-pad, write your ATIS down so that you know what exactly the winds are. Is the controls function, right? So as we're taxiing out, I believe they were 2.2, but I'm just going to, sorry guys. What I'm going to do is go back over to the ATIS here. And for me, I don't usually have to use Phoenix approach. I use that as an example. I like to keep the Phoenix, especially if I'm just doing a local flight, I like to keep the Phoenix ATIS in my standby on COM2 so that I can check that easily when I'm coming back to the airport. So to get to my COM2, you can see my audio panel is set for the mic. So I'm speaking on COM1. I'm listening to COM1. What I need to do is listen to COM2 so I can turn that on. And now this actually allow me to hear both. It should. But this is Flight Simulator, and of course it won't. Okay, well, unless I'm doing something wrong here, 126.5 is definitely the COM2 frequency, and as I mentioned, you should be able to come to COM2 and listen to that audio. And I get nothing on COM2. That's interesting. How many of you guys have experienced that before? Maybe that's something I wasn't aware of that didn't work in the sim, but it certainly should. So we're going to turn off COM2. We'll just keep COM1 going, and we'll listen to it here. So I just want to get the winds, right?
Wind 209er at 8. Visibility 10. Sky condition, few clouds at 1,000 feet, few clouds at 4,000.
Okay, so done. So the reason I did that is because what I can do is use the wind information that I'm aware of for the purposes of my controls into basically the control input as I'm taxiing, so that the wind doesn't affect my taxi any. So I'm going to go ahead and put my tower back in at 18.4 just to get that set again. Okay, there's 18.4 standby, ground 121.8. So the winds are wind is 209, so basically 210, right? And you can see by having the heading bug set, I know where to keep my control. So right now I've got what's called a quartering tailwind. So the wind is coming out of 210 and blowing from the tail to the front. So when you are taxiing, and let's say that's a good 10 knot wind, right? You want to have away, so you want to push down away from the wind and to the right. And this is where you want your controls. Now, the reason you do that is if you can see here where my controls are. So notice how when I'm pushing forward, the elevator is down, right? The elevator is down. Now that's going to keep the wind on top of the airplane. It's going to tend to push this down. And then versus if I had it up, the wind gets underneath here and uses this big board to push my tail up. So I want to keep that down and away from the wind. And you see what happens with your ailerons, right? When I do the right, the left side's down, the right side is up. So now the wind is coming from this direction. Same thing. It's hitting the bottom side, the top side rather, of this aileron on the wing. And it's going to keep that wing down. So if I had it the other way, there'd be a tendency for the wing to go under it and push it up. So this is how you get your stability in your taxiing. And this is what they mean by your control corrections for when you're taxiing with the wind. And you just think about that. If it were coming from this side, it would be the opposite. I would go this way to the left and down, and you can see the change in the ailerons. If it was a straight tailwind coming right down the tailpipe, your ailerons would be neutral, push down. From ahead, just the opposite. Kind of hold your basically that's where you want to do. So neutral from the side, not an issue because it's coming at the side of the airplane, but that's your basic functionality for controlling the airplane and taking winds into account for your taxi. So we're sitting here on the ramp at the fuel station. This is called Atlantic, so you got to know your points when you're calling ATC. And KBAC is current, so basically you want to give your air traffic controller the information, who you are, where you are, and what is it that you want to do. Deer Valley Tower, Cessna 828 Whiskey Whiskey, good morning. We're with you at Atlantic with KBAC, request taxi, VFR departure to the north. That's how you would give your contact to the tower. They would call you back with information. I told them everything they needed to know, who I am, where I am, and what is it that I wanted to do. And the tower would give me a call back and say, Cessna 828 Whiskey Whiskey, taxi to runway 25 left via Charlie. Basically something along those lines. Or he would say 25 left via Charlie, however brief he wanted to be. And now that I've made contact with him, I don't have to use my full call sign. I don't have to say 828 Whiskey Whiskey. I could just say 25 left via Charlie, 8 Whiskey Whiskey. Done. Right? Being brief on the radio, believe me, controllers appreciate it, especially at training airports like Deer Valley and others where there's lots of traffic. You just have to really keep your communications crisp and to the point. So we're going to taxi out to Charlie. Again, just enough throttle to keep us moving. Let's apply our wind correction factor here. Coming up to the intersection. Again, I'm always going to be checking my traffic areas left and right. I don't have any crossing runways here for departure. Now landing, I might. Depending on where they put you. Usually here, if I'm going to the north, we have 2 parallel runways here at Deer Valley, which is super cool and very nice because it keeps traffic flowing very well, and it's not uncommon to see multiple airplanes landing in tandem, coming in parallel approaches to the same runway, which is a beautiful thing. Typically you see that at the big airports, but it's really cool to see here. One of my best moments here at Deer Valley doing that was I was coming from the north, and I was turning in to land on runway 7 left, and coming from the south, and at the same time turning to land on 7 right was a B-25 bomber. He was just ahead of me, actually just behind me, trailing just a little bit, but we were kind of both head on, and we both turned in to final around the same time. And that was just a beautiful sight, and one of those moments that I regretted not having someone there to be able to photograph that, because that was definitely a rare moment to have that aircraft. We have a few of those restored bombers here in the area that take folks up on rides, and they had one, I think it was based on the West Valley, maybe at Falcon Field or over at Gateway, I'm not sure, but it was here doing rides, and I happened to be, we took off. We went our separate ways and ended up coming back around the same time because it was about an hour flight. So it was really, really cool. Now, again, keeping your control inputs on your taxi, just checking things out, visually inspect the windsock on your way down as you get closer to the departure end, just to see what the winds are doing now. Again, rumors and facts. The ATIS is a rumor that was recorded maybe up to an hour ago. The windsock is a fact. It's telling you exactly what's going on with the winds right now. Take a look at the airplanes coming in on a final. How much side slip angle do they have? How much crab are they putting in? Is there a crosswind? You know, what's actually going on right now? You always want to get that information while you're flying, while you're getting yourself ready. Taking a look at your engine instruments every now and then. You know, RPM, fuel, pressure, temperature, everything's in the green and looking good. You know, just making sure all your instruments are set. I missed my standby here, so I'm doing something that I shouldn't be doing right now, and that is putting my head down while I'm taxiing. But so don't do what I do. This is something that should have been covered on the ground when I set the barrow. Again, guys, this is why you practice this stuff, right? Now, if I was sitting in a real plane, I might have forgotten it too, just like I did. And reality is that I probably would have waited. Not probably, would have waited until I stopped, made a mental note, oh, need to set my standby altimeter, and I would have done that once I stopped down here and did my pre-flight, my run-up. So this is why you practice in the flight sim. I know it's a game to many people, but if you're actually a pilot or you're aspiring to be a pilot, you can go through all of these same exact checks in the aircraft while you're, you know, without being in the aircraft, and to kind of keep your head in the game. You'll notice that 1,000 RPM is what we set on the ramp, but you don't really need 1,000 RPM, and I find myself sometimes even pulling back even lower than 900 or 800 RPM in the real airplane, because your speed just gets up, especially if you got a tailwind. Right now we can take a look at our GPS up here. We can see our ground speed is 12 knots. That's a good, comfortable taxi. You don't need to be cruising any faster than that, and especially sometimes, as I mentioned, with that nose wheel shimmy, if you get going too fast, that nose wheel is just banging around, and it feels like you're going to break off the damn strut. So keep your speeds reasonable. I mentioned the parallel runway thing. One thing I always like to talk about, because we won't get to it in this lesson, is the crossing the runways. Super critical. As you know, so many accidents happen from runway incursions, where someone crosses a runway, or like Harrison Ford lands on a taxiway. That's a whole nother thing, but I'll spare him because it can happen, right? I mean, I know it was a butt end of a lot of jokes, but it can happen. Knowing where you are in the airport environment is critical at all times. One of the tips that the airlines do, that I do in my day-to-day practice, is anytime you are in the runway environment, like for right now, before we take off, when I'm holding short for the runway, my strobe lights go on. That's an indicator that I'm about to take the active. I don't have landing lights on, strobes. But when you cross a runway, if in this case, if you were to cross runway 25 left and head over to 25 right, when you cross that runway hold short bar, you put all your lights on. Your landing lights and your strobe lights come on while you are in that runway environment. It is a visual indicator to other aircraft that you are on an active runway. So that's a critical piece, and you know, if you want to fly like the big boys do, big girls do, you do that function, the lights on principle, and it makes sure that you are seen on the surface of the airport when you're crossing your runways. Very critical thing to do, and pilots will appreciate that when you do so. So here we are, holding short, runway 25 left at Delta, and we're going to do our run-up check. This is the last thing we'll do, guys, and then actually the lesson's going to end here, because this was only going to be a pre-flight startup and taxi. We'll follow through from here next time from departure, climb out, maybe do a couple of maneuvers, and then work our way back to the airport. But once I'm set, I would either hold my brakes, or in the sim, because I don't want to hold my brakes, I'll use the parking brake. And in this case now, what I'm going to do now is continue with the run-up check. So we pull out our checklists again, right? We always want to do these things from checklists. You're going to have so much of this stuff committed to memory, but again, if it were committed to memory, I wouldn't have forgotten this. I just want to kind of point that out, as I make fun of myself in a sense, but pointing out how easy it is to forget stuff. So checklist, checklist, checklist. We're going to monitor the tower, switch our radios over to 18.4 for the South Tower. Deer Valley has two tower frequencies, 18.4, and they also have a north frequency that is available here at 120.2. but we're on the south side. And many times when we head north, what will happen is this tower here, who controls on 18.4, the south side, will say monitor north tower. Doesn't mean contact them, just means make sure you monitor the north tower. So because I'm now monitoring the south tower on 18.4, guess what I'm going to do, guys? You got it. Pre-set the frequency for the north tower in anticipation of that handoff. This is what I mean by being ahead of the aircraft. Now, if you didn't do that and you're in the middle of a climb out and you're turning right, you're looking for traffic, and all of a sudden Deer Valley says monitor north tower, he's probably not even going to give you the frequency. He's just going to say monitor the north tower. He's expecting you to know that. So to be ready, queue up your frequency and get it set. So that's 120.2. We're going to set that, and that will be ready so that all I then have to do is push the transfer button, and I'm ready to go live on the north tower. I don't have to talk to the controller, just need to listen. So 120.2 is now set. Brakes are set. Seat backs upright. Doors closed and locked. Windows closed. Now for me, my window stays open until I'm ready to taxi onto the active, just because it's hot and I don't have AC in a 172, as you know, and it's not that bad today. I think they said the temperature was 25. Yeah, it sure is 25 degrees. So yeah, it's okay. But most days when I'm out here somewhere, it's 30 plus, and it's damn hot. So that window stays open until I absolutely need to close it. Flight instruments checked and set. We're just going to check everything and make sure the engine instruments are all set. So we've got our altitude set for 3,000. Altimeter set 2988. We have the heading bug set for the winds, which I will now go ahead and sequence for the runway heading. We have on the right side, we'll check our RPMs. Leaned out, we're going to go ahead up to 1,000. Get that set where we, just to keep it, it's a little low. Many times if you get the RPM too low, you'll get a low vacuum warning. And that's because the engine's not spinning fast enough, if you will, to drive that vacuum pump to provide the accurate amount. So fuel flow, oil pressures in the green, temperatures in the green, EGT is good, VAC's in the green, fuel quantity is checked, we've confirmed, electrical looks good, engine hour is 17.6. There's this TAC that I said that we should have seen on the left, PFD, we didn't when we started up. Check our batteries and amps, all good. Airspeed's looking good, artificial horizon's good. Secondary standby altimeter set. Check the calibration on that, check the baro is set, and this is where I would have caught it, right? This is why we do our checklist. I would have caught it here. Everything's good. Throttles at 1,000, magnetos. So now we're going to take the throttles up to 1,800 RPM, and we're going to check the mags. Again, before we do that, brakes, confirm set. I'm actually going to apply my foot brakes as well, just in case the parking brake gives loose. Brakes set, 1,800 RPM. And get around 1,800. I always seem to get like 1,810 in here. And then we're going to check our mags and make sure that we're within limits. So we're going to go 2 clicks on the ignition key to the left. Look for the drop. Going down to 1710 is my guess here in this aircraft. Was 1710, 1720. There it is, 1710. Yeah. Back to both. So that's an acceptable drop. So we want to make sure that those are within limits. We're going to do 1 click to the left. Check the left side. 100 RPM drop, max 50 between the two, 1710 as well. So we're within 100 RPM drop and 50 between the two. We have good mags. We can clear both to clear that. We're going to check our engine instruments again here at 1,800 RPM. Pressures, everything's in the green. It's all looking good. Amps and voltage and charge are good. Throttle is idle for the idle check. Okay, now, one other thing I want to mention here too, real quick before we get to that point, is we're actually going to go full power, and I'm actually going to check and set our mixture. So we'll go mixture full rich, power full. And now we're going to lean back the power. Now for me in the 172, we're looking for the fuel. I know I'm taking a little longer than I normally would. And I should have had this the first thing I did. It's a checklist. It's a different checklist I'm using today. So in that checklist, we would actually lean the aircraft first before we went through the mag check. We go straight from this to the mag. So I'm going to do it again. So here we go. Full power's in, 2240 RPM. We're in the green band. We're looking at the fuel flow gauge, and we want to get that here with the temperatures below 100, like it is 90 degrees where it is. We want that fuel flow to sit right at the top of the green. So we're going to bring that on back until we get right to the top of the green. And that's where we want it to be set for our flight. Then we're going to bring the power back to 1,800 RPM now that we are fully leaned properly. We go back to 1,800 here, and I won't do it again, but I'm just going to show you kind of the process, right? We do the mixture, then we come back to 1,800 RPM, and then we would check our mags left and right. And then once we were done with that, we go to an idle check all the way down And again, you probably get that boom, boom, low voltage annunciator would probably come on, but we just want to make sure the engine still runs at idle because that's critical for us, especially on approach. Throttle back to 1,000 RPM, and we can adjust the friction lock on that if we need to, depending on how sticky the throttle is. These airplanes have this knob here is a friction knob, and you can turn that left to tighten it, turn it right to loosen it, and that's how you can make sure that the throttle is smooth, but not too smooth that you inadvertently push it in at a time that you don't need it. So we've gone through the throttle friction lock set. That's that checklist complete, and now we're going to do the before takeoff check. Takeoff briefing is complete. Now for the takeoff briefing, I just like to advise, especially if my passengers and if I'm by myself, I just brief it to myself. You know, the direction of flight, where we're heading, the runway, the direction we're going to be flying in, what to do in the case of an engine failure on application of power or while we're on the runway before we get to a critical speed, and what to do after we depart. So for me, again, critical speed, we have anything critical that takes place that impinges upon the safety of the flight before we get to our VR of 55 knots. Power goes full back to idle, flaps up, brakes fully apply, and if it happens after departure, we'll look for a suitable place to land straight ahead and deal with the emergency at that point in time. We'll take runway 25 left, we'll plan on a departure to the north. We're going to climb up to 3,000 feet, and then we'll look for basically further instructions from there in terms of what we're going to do. If in the event of an emergency, I'll handle the controls and handle the radios. It'll be my airplane. Any questions? Leave off with any questions every time if you have someone sitting in the right seat with you. That's kind of where we leave off with. So before takeoff briefing has been complete, fuel selector valve both, shutoff valve is in, trim is set. We're going to look to have that set for takeoff trim. Flaps set. I don't need flaps for the departure here today, so flaps are going to remain up. The autopilot, I'm not going to test it. I don't have. I'm not going to be using it here. GPS 1.2. It doesn't exist here. There's a menu in here that takes you to on the right MFD where you go to and check out the GPS 1 and 2 signals. This shows you how many satellites are available. We don't have that functionality in this G1000 version. I think there's maybe an aftermarket that does, but that's how it's set. Circuit breakers checked that they're in. Make sure nothing's popped out. Mags are confirmed on both. Fuel quantities checked. Again, half tanks is what we expected for our short flight today. Cabin doors and windows closed, and as I mentioned, I would usually have my window open until I was cleared onto the runway. Now we're going to go ahead and do our lineup checks. I'm just going to get this out of the way, right? Now lineup here, it shows that the landing light's on. I don't like to put my landing light on until I'm cleared onto the active runway. What I will do, however, is put my strobes on, and that I will use for when I am to notify that I'm going to be ready for departure. At that point, that takes us to where we need to be for the for this particular video, talking through the actual pre-flight, the taxi, the startup, and checking our aircraft out for flight. Join us next time. Hopefully, if this video was helpful for you, go ahead and smash the subscribe button, hit the like button as well, and I'll bring more content like this to you. A little bit long-winded, but so much appreciate you being here with us, and hope that you gain some information out of this and enjoy your future flights and flying. Until next time, talk to you soon.